Okay. So socialism. Again, with socialism, you'll find tons of different definitions. You talk to, three socialists, you may get three different definitions of what socialism is, and out there, you will see again people calling things socialist when they're not socialist. Um, okay, essentially, the idea, at least my reading of of the history, um, is collectively owned means of production. So the firms essentially, or the people who are producing, are owned collectively. So it could be like in workers' co-ops. Um, in practice, historically in practice, this has been the state. So the state then has owned the firms. So the state has essentially been the operator in the industry. All right, the sole operator usually. So it doesn't have to be the state, but at least, especially when we're talking about the Cold War, it is the state. It devolves usually into the state. Now, the goal here is cooperation over competition. So remember, in capitalism, you have a bunch of different firms competing, and there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers. Um, by the way, I should mention one of the critiques of capitalism is that it devolves into monopoly, that it's kind of, if you leave it alone, it devolves into that. So you kind of need something to stop it from devolving into this. Okay. But anyways, so here the goal would be cooperation, that okay, instead of a bunch of different firms competing, why not just have one firm where everyone cooperates and just does their best. um, Now theoretically it could be used in conjunction with a market, so you could have kind of these first two aspects of capitalism. So there's not like the capitalism and socialism are necessarily like diametrically opposed or at like opposite ends of a spectrum. Like you could have private property and you could have markets, um, but the firms could just be owned collectively. So typically in capitalism, the firm is owned by an individual. So there's like one person or a group of people that own the firms. Um, so you could just switch this part of it to be collective ownership. Now communism would be like getting rid of all of this, no private property. Many kind of communist theorists saw socialism as kind of like the bridge between capitalism and communism. It's like we'd be socialist first and then we'll get to communism. Okay, but we're just talking about socialism because none of these countries ever got to being communist. Okay, so you could theoretically have a market and private property. Also, within capitalism, you could just do your firms. Essentially, you could think of a way of doing your firms stock options, where the workers are theoretically the owners. In fact, when stock options were first used, I believe they were first used in Silicon Valley in the '60s. I could be wrong about that, but I know when they were used in Silicon Valley in the '60s, they were seen as socialist. Okay, so you could kind of have parts of each of these within each other. So you could theoretically have a market and private property. Socialism as practiced during the Cold War, typically the state owned the industries, and then the markets. There was not. They also didn't have markets. They essentially set prices instead of letting the market decide what the prices are. Okay, all right, and so that is kind of briefly the idea, some sort of collective ownership of the means of production. Let's talk about what it is not. Okay, so typically, or a lot of times, when people think about socialism, they think about Northern European countries. Okay, these are not socialist countries. Okay, they are social democracies. Essentially, they are mixed economies. So they have state ownership in some areas of the economy, but they have private property and markets in other areas and private ownership of firms in other areas. So in some industries, essentially, they are socialist. In other industries, they are using a market economy, a capitalist economy. They have a high degree of redistribution, though, essentially taking money from the wealthy and moving it to the poor. All right. And so again, this is confusing because oftentimes when you talk to somebody who's a democratic socialist, what they want is this, which is technically social democracy. They want redistribution and some state ownership, but not full state ownership, not full collectivization in every industry. So they typically want something like universal healthcare, or maybe universal college, which would be government operating in the healthcare sector and government operating in the education center, but they don't want I don't know, like the government owning all the food or something like that. So again, it's very confusing. um, but these countries are mixed economies. Okay, redistribution again is not so. Oftentimes, like in the beginning of the pandemic, when the government sent checks to people, people characterize this as socialism. All right, this is redistribution. So redistribution could exist in either system. So you could have it. You could have a high degree of redistribution in either system. Okay. In fact, many capitalist societies have to have this because of the destabilizing nature of capitalism. Okay, essentially, well, not the destabilizing nature, and then the unequal nature of it. So, essentially, you have to have some level of redistribution if you have innovation putting people out of business. So you're going to have innovation and new invention putting people out of business. So you need some redistribution to compensate the people who have been displaced, and then also in certain markets for necessities. So if you just have a market for necessity, you got a market for bread, market for housing, low income households will not be able to sometimes afford those necessities. And so oftentimes you need some level of redistribution in order to deliver those basic goods to the low income population. So essentially, redistribution or some sort of universal basic income, which has become popular these days, this idea of just essentially moving resources around, it's essentially moving from the rich to the poor, by my definition, is neither capitalist nor socialist. It could theoretically exist in both systems. I mean, you could have essentially collectivization where the state owns certain industries and still have redistribution on top of that for essentially the people that are not able to work. And you can have it in a capitalist society. We have it here. We have food stamps for food. We have housing choice vouchers for housing. We have disability insurance. We have unemployment insurance. All of these are not necessarily socialist. They are just redistribution. You could have universal. We have universal basic income actually in Alaska. Alaska has some. They have essentially everyone in Alaska gets a check each year from their oil fund. Okay, so those are our definitions, at least for the sake of this class. Again, these are our theoretical definitions of capitalism and socialism. Let's think about the problems in each one, typically endemic to each one. Capitalism will produce inequality. You will have, your entrepreneurs, your innovators, your really good innovators, your really good entrepreneurs, they will be more wealthy than those that do not have those skills that the market values. The market may devolve. So our markets may be captured by certain firms in the form of monopoly, regulatory capture, or cronyism, collusion between the firms, or, one firm may be able to dominate the market, or they may use government to keep their competitors out. So it may devolve into that. So we may need some sort of government institutions or laws to deal with this. And they may be subject to market failure. So the classic one is, which was covered in Econ 101, probably actually like the third or fourth week, is externalities. So the markets, if you have a market, there may be certain costs that the market doesn't take into account, like pollution, those sorts of things. Environmental costs typically is the big one. And so that's what we call a market failure, where the market is not taking that into account. So again, you need some sort of way to adjust for that or correct for that. So these are the different problems of capitalism that you may need to add some institutions or laws on top of to deal with these things. Problems with socialism when it's practiced oftentimes is it can be very corrupt. So you have a state-run industry. So, there's somebody in charge of this state-run industry, or the workers collective or something like that. The person's in charge may be subject to corruption. They may give choice jobs or choice resources to family members or friends. Since, in capitalism, if you're essentially a inefficient firm, you will go out of business. But since you're the only firm in socialism, you can be inefficient. You can kind of give a job to somebody who's not as competent as somebody else. And so they are oftentimes subject to corruption. They oftentimes, again, just like capitalism may devolve into monopoly, socialism, they tend to start democratically, but then devolve into authoritarian states. So it's not, it's not necessarily going to happen, but it typically happens. You saw that in Venezuela. We saw it in Bolivia recently. All right. And then there is a lack of incentive. Since you don't have competition, there is a lack of incentive, and there's a lack of incentive to innovate or essentially put forth your best effort. So you see this classically in China before they switched to a market economy. Or once they switched to a market economy, yields of their crops increased 5 times. Essentially, before that, since there was no kind of connection between what you produced and what you consumed, essentially whatever you were given an allotment, not based on your production, rather just as a basic right, there was no incentive to work or innovate in the agricultural sector. And so they had depressed crop yields. After they switched to a market economy, increased as much as 5 times. All right, there's actually a similar thing happened in the US at its founding. The Pilgrims initially started with a more socialist form of agriculture, but they switched to private property. Okay. All right. And so in reality, so these are our theoretical economic systems. Again, they're not necessarily diametrically opposed to one another. You can have elements of capitalism within socialism. You could have elements of socialism within capitalism. But, they're generally put at opposites. And certainly in the Cold War, they were pitted as opposites. So let's look at the reality. So the reality is that, most of these NATO countries, the US included, were market economies in most industries. So in most industries, you had a market economy, private firms, that sort of thing. But you did have government control and command and control in a few key markets. So essentially every country had socialized education. The government runs education, K through 12. Infrastructure. The government runs infrastructure. The government decides where the roads are going to be built and how many roads are going to be built. Okay, that is socialized infrastructure. Defense. The government decides how many tanks they're going to build, how many aircrafts they're going to build. There's not a private market here. So this is, again, socialized defense. Natural resources. So some countries, some NATO countries, have the government runs, the coal industry, or the government runs the oil industry. Not in the US, but in many countries, they have a socialized version of whatever the extractive industry is, coal, diamonds, oil. And then in some countries, the healthcare system is nationalized. Okay, so most prominently, the UK has the NHS, and Canada as well. So the UK and its offshoots do healthcare, do socialized medicine. France and Germany have essentially a market economy with price controls. And in the US, we have our system, which is basically employer-sponsored health insurance, which we have because of a weird quirk of history in World War II, but we'll get into all that later in the course. But anyways, the point is, these companies these countries are mixed. They have market economies in most markets, but in these kind of key markets, education, infrastructure, defense, sometimes resources, sometimes healthcare, they're doing a socialism. Your Eastern Bloc countries and your Soviet Union are command and control. So the government does own the means of production in almost all the industries. So the government is essentially either directly owning it or, giving direction in terms of what is produced, what the prices will be. All right, let's take a break.